Hello everyone. Today we're continuing our series on attacks and we're talking about a very basic attack called computer viruses. Now, viruses are pieces of software that infect computers. It could be servers, it could be home PCs, it could be basically everything that runs some kind of operating system. A virus has two important characteristics. First of all, it needs a host program. That's why the name virus that's why a virus is called what it's called, because as a natural occurring virus, which needs its hosts in order to survive and in order to reproduce, a computer virus also needs a host program. Furthermore, the virus is, as is an airborne virus, able to reproduce. The important thing here, the important distinction, for example, in distinction to computer worms, for example, or Trojan horses, is that a virus is not a separate executable. So a virus cannot run on its own, it needs a host program. Now, how does a computer virus reproduce? Let's look at how a virus is built up. First of all, we have a virus ID. So when the virus begins, it has some kind of ID, some kind of code, which is also used by antivirus tools in order to detect viruses within executables, for example. Then after the virus ID, after the begin of the code, there is the infection happening. This is how the virus actually reproduces. It looks for non-infected executables and it checks this by checking whether this ID of this virus is actually in this executable it currently queries. So if it's not yet there, it copies itself into the program. Then usually there's some kind of trigger, also called logical bomb. For example, in this case, if a certain date is reached, or maybe if a certain action is triggered, then the payload gets executed. In this case, we just format the hard drive. But you could really think of any payload thinkable in this section. Finally, optional, it could go back to the host program to conceal that it did anything, or obviously if you format the hard drive, then there is no host program to come back to. But viruses don't need to do damage. They can also gather information, maybe spawn a reverse shell, stuff like that. And then you can jump back to the host program so that the victim actually doesn't really know that anything happened. So viruses are basically classified into three classes. We have program or link viruses, which is basically what we talked about until now. So viruses that infect executables. Then we have boot viruses, so viruses that you can think of are infecting the boot sector. So you can't get rid of them really. They just infect, or they get started every time the machine is booted up. And finally, we have macro or data viruses. First, let's talk about program or link viruses. Here on the right, you see a normal program, how a normal program works. You have some kind of name and you have some kind of length, like a byte size. And you have, when you start a program, a pointer, which upon startup tells the program where to jump to, where the program starts. So you imagine double-clicking the program, then there's some kind of pointer, in this case it's 4500, and upon starting the program, it jumps to this address in order to execute the program. So far, so good. Now, what happens is if a program gets infected, obviously the length, so the byte size changes, and I will come back to this a bit later. And what the virus does is it overrides the pointer address. So now it doesn't jump to the benign program code, but rather to the virus code. So upon opening the executable, upon executing it, the virus gets executed instead. As I've said previously, there is the possibility, which is very often the case, that the virus itself now jumps to the original address of the benign program so that the victim doesn't even realize that a virus was executed. Next, we have our boot virus. And if you imagine us turning on your machine, the CPU is the first thing that's operating. And so it loads the operating system and the drivers are loaded. And finally, some configuration files are loaded. And that's the whole boot up process. Obviously very simplified. However, if there's a boot virus infecting your system, then before the boot program gets executed, there's the virus code, which just loads the virus, and it loads the ID, and it basically makes it persistent this way via boot up. And to see how this could work, we can look at this famous example of the SoBig virus, which was one of the first viruses. In fact, it was a boot virus a couple of almost decades ago now. And what it did, or how it got propagated, was via email, and there was an attachment, and this attachment had some kind of ending. I don't remember which one, but when it was executed, the virus within the attachment installed, or basically copied, an executable called winmgm32.exe into the C Windows folder. And what it also did is it altered the registry, and it basically added these two lines, or these two values, into the registry, which mean that winmgm32.exe gets executed upon startup. So this is an example that actually happened, and so it's not, you see here that it's not very hard. Once you get access to this, and when you can alter the registry, you can do these things. Luckily nowadays it's not possible anymore, at least not as easily as it has been earlier. Next, we move on to macro viruses. So a macro, as you probably know, is written in VBA, so in Visual Basic for applications, in all Office products, so Excel, Word, even PowerPoint, and so on. And what it does is you can basically script your way around the normal functions in order to automate some processes. It's very, very, very helpful, and a lot of companies actually have, and I know this from experience, have a lot of especially Excel sheets with macros. So a lot of their processes rely on these macros. So that's why, and I will come back to this later, but that's why they're not disabled by default. Luckily, this is also a trend that's slowly disappearing over time. So macros are luckily not as common as they were a couple of years ago, but they still exist, and they still pose a great threat, because you can program macros to do basically anything, and antivirus tools don't really detect them. But we not only have macros, we can also inject our malware code, our virus, into MIME, which is used to send emails with attachments basically, or PostScript, and we have in ANI files, in GIF files, WMF files, so all these file types that are not executable per se. They're not meant to be executable, but the way they're rendered or the way they're processed makes it still possible to include malware code, to include a virus, to include shellcode, for example. So how do we mitigate against viruses? Well, first of all, as you've seen with the program virus example, that the length of the program, the byte size, changes, because I now injected some code into it, so naturally it increases. So what you can do is you can check the hash values of the program you downloaded, for example, and the hash value that it should have, because some, or let's say good distributors of software actually tell you the hash code of a certain piece of software you download. And if you check this with the downloaded hash value, and you can see that there's a difference, then don't execute it, delete it immediately. And probably inform the person distributing the software that the software is infected. The next thing you can do, obviously, is encrypting, or use encryption. For example, viruses propagate through address books, and if your address book is encrypted, then this is no longer possible. Finally, you can see here that macros nowadays are per default disabled, and you need to explicitly allow macros, which is a step in the right direction. But as I've said, a lot of business processes actually still they rely on macros. So a lot of people actually enable macros if they, for example, get a Excel sheet via email, via a trusted email. The two more obvious mitigation tactics is obviously using antivirus software, which looks for these kind of virus codes, for these virus IDs. So, for example, we had this virus ID 4711 in our example here, and an antivirus actually scans the machine code for these kinds of IDs. And so viruses that are known can be found through antiviruses. If it's a new virus, a novel virus, then it can't be found, obviously. Finally, you can use surveillance. You can log anything. You can monitor all the web traffic. For example, in a company, you should never roll out software without, for example, testing it in a sandbox, which is just a virtual machine where there is no damage done if this virtual machine crashes, for example. However, there are viruses and malware, and we've seen this in previous videos, that actually check for that, and they know they're in a virtual machine, and so they don't trigger the payload. You know, you've seen the trigger part. Very often it says, well, if the graphics card is a typical VM graphics card, or if I have very, very low memory, which is also typical for VMs. But still, it's better than nothing, and it's a good idea to always check your software in sandboxes before installing them or rolling them out, even company-wide. This concludes this video on viruses. Our series on attacks will continue with computer worms and Trojan horses and so on. So I'll see you hopefully in the next.